Amun-Herkhepeshef, and it chased warriors of the Hassa tribes across the Negev, as far as the Dead Sea, capturing Edom Seir. It then marched on to capture Moab. The other force, led by Ramesses, attacked Jerusalem and Jericho. He too then entered Moab, where he rejoined his son. The reunited army then marched on Heshbon, Damascus, on to Kamiti, and finally, recaptured Upi, the land around Damascus, re-establishing Egypt's former sphere of influence. Ramesses extended his military successes in his 8th and 9th years. He crossed the Dog River Nahr el-Kalb and pushed north into Amurru. His armies managed to march as far north as Dapur, where he had a statue of himself erected. The Egyptian pharaoh thus found himself in northern Amurru, well past Kadesh, in Tunub, where no Egyptian soldier had been seen since the time of Thutmose III. Almost 120 years earlier, he laid siege to the city before capturing it. His victory proved to be ephemeral. In year 9, Ramesses erected a stele at Bethshean. After having reasserted his power over Canaan, Ramesses led his army north. A mostly illegible stele near Beirut, which appears to be dated to the king's 2nd year, was probably set up there in his 10th. The thin strip of territory pinched between Amurru and Kadesh did not make for a stable possession. Within a year, they had returned to the Hittite fold, so that Ramesses had to march against Dapur once more in his 10th year. This time, he claimed to have fought the battle without even bothering to put on his corselet, until 2 hours after the fighting began. 6 of Ramesses's youthful sons, still wearing their sidelocks, took part in this conquest. He took towns in Retchenu and Tunub in Naharan, later recorded on the walls of the Ramesseum. This second success at the location was equally as meaningless as his first. As neither power could decisively defeat the other in battle, Egyptian responded that the times of intrigue in support of Mersili III had passed. Atwili III wrote to Kadashman in Lil II, Kassite king of Cardunia Babylon, in the same spirit, reminding him of the time when his father, Kadashman Turgu, had offered to fight Ramesses II, the king of Egypt. The Hittite king encouraged the Babylonian to oppose another enemy, which must have been the king of Assyria, whose allies had killed the messenger of the Egyptian king. Atwili encouraged Kadashman in Lil to come to his aid and prevent the Assyrians from cutting the link between the Canaanite province of Egypt and Mersili III. The ally of Ramesses, Ramesses II, also campaigned south of the first cataract of the Nile into Nubia. When Ramesses was about 22, 2 of his own sons, including Amun-Herkhepeshef, accompanied him in at least one of those campaigns. By the time of Ramesses, Nubia had been a colony for 200 years, but its conquest was recalled in decoration from the temples Ramesses II built at Beit el-Wali, which was the subject of epigraphic work by the Oriental Institute during the Nubian salvage campaign of the 1960s, Jerf Hussein, and Kalabsha in northern Nubia. On the south wall of the Beit el-Wali temple, Ramesses II is depicted charging into battle against tribes south of Egypt in a war chariot, while his 2 young sons, Amun-Herkhepeshef and Kamwasit, are shown behind him, also in war chariots. A wall in one of Ramesses's temples says he had to fight one battle with those tribes without help from his soldiers. During the reign of Ramesses II, the Egyptians were evidently active on a 300 km 190 mi stretch along the Mediterranean coast, at least as far as Zayatham el Rakim, where remains of a fortress described by its texts as built on Libyan's land have been found. Although the exact event surrounding the foundation of the coastal forts and fortresses is not clear, some degree of political and military control must have been held over the region to allow their construction. There are no detailed accounts of Ramesses I's undertaking large military actions against the Libyans, only generalized records of his conquering and crushing them, which may or may not refer to specific events that were otherwise unrecorded. It may be that some of the records, such as the Aswan stele of his year 2, are harking back to Ramesses's presence on his father's Libyan campaigns. Perhaps it was Seti I who achieved this supposed control over the region, and who planned to establish the defensive system, in a manner similar to how he rebuilt those to the east, the ways of Horus across northern Sinai, after reigning for 30 years. Ramesses joined a select group that included only a handful of Egypt's longest-lived rulers. By tradition, in the 30th year of his reign, Ramesses celebrated a jubilee called the Est Festival. These were held to honor and rejuvenate the pharaoh's strength. Only halfway through what would be a 66-year reign, Ramesses had already eclipsed all but a few of his greatest predecessors in his achievements. He had brought peace, maintained Egyptian borders, and built great and numerous monuments across the empire. His country was more prosperous and powerful than it had been in nearly a century. Est festivals traditionally were held again every 3 years after the 30th year. Ramesses II, who sometimes held them after 2 years, eventually celebrated an unprecedented 13 or 14 in the 3rd year of his reign. Ramesses started the most ambitious building project after the pyramids, which were built almost 1,500 years earlier. The population was put to work changing the face of Egypt. Ramesses built extensively from the Delta to Nubia, covering the land with buildings in a way no monarch before him had. Some of the activities undertaken were focused on remodeling or usurping existing works, improving masonry techniques, and using art as propaganda. In Thebes, the ancient temples were transformed so that each one of them reflected honor to Ramesses as a symbol of his putative divine nature and power. The elegant but shallow reliefs of previous pharaohs were easily transformed, and so their images and words could easily be obliterated by their successors. Ramesses insisted that his carvings be deeply engraved into the stone, which made them not only less susceptible to later alteration, but also made them more prominent in the Egyptian sun, reflecting his relationship with the sun deity. Ramesses used art as a means of propaganda for his victories over foreigners, which are depicted on numerous temple reliefs. His cartouches are prominently displayed even in buildings that he did not construct. He founded a new capital city in the Delta during his reign, called Pi-Ramses. It previously had served as a summer palace during Setii's reign. Ramesses II expanded gold mining operations in Akwiyati, modern-day Wadi Alaki. Ramesses also undertook many new construction projects. 2 of his biggest works, besides Pi-Ramses, were the temple complex of Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum, a mortuary temple in western Thebes. Pi-Ramses. Main article. Pi-Ramses. Ramesses II moved the capital of his kingdom from Thebes in the Nile Valley to a new site in the eastern delta. His motives are uncertain, although he possibly wished to be closer to his territories in Canaan and Syria. The new city of Pi-Ramses, or to give the full name, Pi-Ramses Aa Naktu, meaning domain of Ramesses, great in victory, was dominated by huge temples and his vast residential palace, complete with its own zoo. In the 10th century the Bible, exegete Rabbi Saadia Gaon believed that the biblical site of Ramesses had to be identified with Ain Shams. For a time, during the early 20th century, the site was misidentified as that of Tanis, due to the amount of statuary and other material from Pi-Ramesses found there, but it now is recognized that the Ramesside remains at Tanis were brought there from elsewhere, and the real Pi-Ramesses lies about 30 kilometers 18.6 mi south, near modern Cantor. The colossal feet of the statue of Ramesses are almost all that remains above ground today. The rest is buried in the fields. 55. The temple complex built by Ramesses II between Kurna and the desert has been known as the Ramesseum since the 19th century. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus marveled at the gigantic temple, now no more than a few ruins, oriented northwest and southeast. The temple was preceded by 2 courts. An enormous pylon stood before the first court, with the royal palace at the left and the gigantic statue of the king looming up at the back. Only fragments of the base and torso remain of the Syenite statue of the enthroned pharaoh, 17 meters 56 feet high, and weighing more than 1,000 tons 980 long tons, 1,100 short tons. Scenes of the great pharaoh and his army triumphing over the Hittite forces fleeing before Kadesh are represented on the pylon. Remains of the second court include part of the internal facade of the pylon and a portion of the Osirid portico on the right. Scenes of war and the alleged rout of the Hittites at Kadesh are repeated on the walls. In the upper registers, feast in honor of the phallic deity Min, god of fertility. On the opposite side of the court, the few osiride pillars and columns still remaining may furnish an idea of the original grandeur. 59 scattered remains of the two statues of the seated king also may be seen, one in pink granite and the other in black granite, which once flanked the entrance to the temple. 39 out of the 48 columns in the great hypostyle hall, 31 meters, still stand in the central rows. They are decorated with the usual scenes of the king before various deities. Part of the ceiling, decorated with gold stars on a blue ground, also has been preserved. Ramesses's children appear in the procession on the few walls left. The sanctuary was composed of 3 consecutive rooms, with 8 columns and the tetrastyle cell. Part of the first room, with the ceiling decorated with astral scenes, and few remains of the second room are all that is left. Vast storerooms built of mud bricks stretched out around the temple. Traces of a school for scribes were found among the ruins. A temple of Seti, of which nothing remains beside the foundations, once stood to the right of the hypostyle, had offered to fight Ramesses II, the king of Egypt. The Hittite king encouraged the Babylonian to oppose another enemy, which must have been the king of Assyria, whose allies had killed the messenger of the Egyptian king. Atwili encouraged Kadashman and Lil to come to his aid and prevent the Assyrians from cutting the link between the Canaanite province of Egypt and Mersili III. The ally of Ramesses, Ramesses II, also campaigned south of the first cataract of the Nile into Nubia. When Ramesses was about 22, 2 of his own sons, including Amun Herkhapeshef, accompanied him in at least one of those campaigns. By the time of Ramesses, Nubia had been a colony for 200 years. Hall.